Hi, everyone. I'm Sierra Schnitzer, the Senior Director of Survivor Supports and Initiatives at Jewish Women International. I am so thankful for everyone to be here today. We have an incredible presentation. I'd like to pass it over. First, I want to say thank you to OVW for funding this incredible project. And today we will be hearing from Malika and Dr. Berthe about cultural competency, our cultural competency training, overcoming.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Um, so let me go ahead and share my screen again. Are you still able to see it? Today we're going to gain some self-awareness about how cultural biases, including from boys and men of faith, can hinder our work and why we must strive for cultural humility. We'll gain cultural competency specific to gender-based violence advocacy, learning how to address the needs of survivors within diverse faith contexts. And we hope advocates will be able to identify and address potential barriers rooted in faith-based misconceptions that survivors may face when seeking support or intervention. We're so excited to have Dr. Denise Berthe and Malika Kaur today to lead our presentations. And we are going to start actually with an opening question from our Interfaith Consortium. I will call on everybody to streamline this process. To engage men of faith as allies, what are the common misconceptions by outsiders associated with your faith when it comes to addressing gender-based violence, and why is it important to dispel these misconceptions? Let's begin with sojourners.
Hello, everyone. Sandy Ovalle, Director of Campaigns and Mobilizing with Sojourners. We come from an ecumenical Christian background. That means we deal with anyone from evangelical traditions to traditions that are historic churches, historic Protestant churches. So many of the misconceptions that people have about our faith when it comes to addressing gender-based violence is that that Christianity can be a heavily male-dominated tradition. In fact, there are many frameworks in the Bible of how our faith deals with women and how it deals with elevating the position of women in societies. Other misconceptions that exist within how Christian places address this, and that in some ways many churches have in the past not been equipped to do that, is the fact that many of our churches do not have the tools to address this. So churches oftentimes take Bible verses out of context and deal with domestic violence and other types of interpersonal violence through the lenses of perseverance. Like people should just have perseverance. People should be long suffering. Those are values that traditionally have been supported by the faith. However, those values do not support enduring violence that is against the person. Other frameworks that are more helpful are frameworks that focus on the fact that every person is made into the image of God. And so that while we identified with Jesus' suffering and identify with being people that understand that there is purpose in life, we do not support anything that attempts against the image of God in every person, that anything that diminishes the personhood of someone should be condemned and we should not participate in that. So any other misconceptions, or some of the other misconceptions that exist as to how our faith addresses gender-based violence, include the disparity of power in people. And so what we'd like to remind folks in these faith spaces is that we are new creations. That's what the Bible talks about in our scriptures, that we are new creations. And in new creations, what we try to do is to even out the power disparities, that there are no longer people that should have more oppressive power or oppressive power over others, but rather that we're all made into the image of God and equally deserve protections, equally deserve the ability to speak into what we want for our lives and to decide about how our society functions. So those are some of the most common misconceptions as to how Christianity addresses gender-based violence and some of the ways in which we can dispel them.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you so much. Everyone, Sandy will stay on also at the end if there are any follow-up questions. I now want to call on Ayana from Ujima.
Thank you. So I actually didn't frame this in terms of like breaking it down by faith, since we aren't necessarily faith specific. I really framed it in terms of how is a Black man or Black boy across any faith viewed, and what are some of the misconceptions that translate across religions and across faiths. So some that stuck out to me, just to name a few, like there are a ton, but to name a few, that Black men are fatherless or without mentors or guidance, that Black men are inherently violent, that Black men are hypermasculine, and so violence should be expected, that Black men don't have a range of emotions and can't be nurturers, that, again, Black men of any faith has almost a desire to dominate their family, and that can even mean to brutalize their family in order to maintain a position of leadership, and that violence is part of the culture. And we see it play out in a lot of different ways. Like Black Muslim men face a lot of different tropes that impact how people view them. Black Christian men face a lot of different tropes in how people view them and how people engage as well. And so to think about, if folks have these narratives in their minds, it's really hard to begin to even frame out how do you do prevention work or how do you do intervention work with people who aren't seen as redeemable. And so to really make sure to shift those narratives and reframe those narratives so that people want to engage and those folks also want to engage back with you is really important to have those combos.
Great. Thank you so much, Ayana. Ayana will also stay on. And after each of you present, if you could put the name of your organization and your contact info or your website into the chat for everybody, that would be really helpful if anyone wants to follow up. I will now call on Sharon from Catholics for Family Peace.
Hello, everyone. We're excited to be with you. I enjoyed hearing my colleagues' comments because they apply to the Catholic Christians as well, many of them. So while Catholic and Protestant Christians do share many common beliefs, we oftentimes work together around poverty or homelessness or racial injustice. There are some key critical differences that might be useful to you. I call them no divorce, forgiveness, and what is this about submission and headship? So it's true, Catholic Christians do not practice divorce per se. We believe that a sacramental marriage is not dissolvable. Among other criteria, that means that a sacramental marriage means that both people entered it with the intent and capacity to love, respect, and honor each other. So when difficulties arise, the question is this a sacramental marriage? We do have a process called annulments. It's just like a civil annulment. It's not a divorce. It is a recognition that a marriage did not exist in the first place. So I think the misconception is that Catholics can't divorce, and that's not true. The priority, particularly around gender-based violence, is that we encourage everyone to be safe, and particularly for the sake of the children. But Catholics are allowed to separate should their safety be in grave danger. But and another point that I find is oftentimes challenged or misunderstood is forgiveness. Forgiveness is a critical Catholic belief, and we are each called to forgive. It's hard, it's a process, and many of us don't accomplish it all the time or at all. But it's important to realize that forgiveness is simply a decision to let God make the judgment about someone who's harmed me. It does not mean that the harmful behavior is condoned or is allowed to be repeated. And in regards to that, when someone says they're sorry, to ask for forgiveness requires two additional things. It requires a resolve to not repeat the behavior and to make amends when possible. So forgiveness is oftentimes used in abusive situations. You have to forgive me. And sure, I'll let God make the final decision, but what's happening it cannot be repeated. It's not condoned. I think that the easiest way to understand the third point about headship and submission is like my colleagues, is to we believe that everyone is made in the image of God, and we have equal dignity. So there's like no space to mistreat each other. Referring to Ephesians 5, St. Paul uses the term subordinate, and he says to be subordinate to each other out of reverence for Christ. We believe that life here on earth is short, and our job is to be kind and loving to each other.
Thank you so much, Sharon. If anyone has any follow-up questions for Sharon, she's going to put her contact info into the chat as well. Now let's move over to Sunny from Korean American Family Services.
Hello. Sunny Kim from KFAM, Korean American Family Services, and we do work very closely with Korean immigrant faith leaders, Christian dominantly. And to answer this question, I think Sharon answered most of it. So I was thinking the misconception that I had was around forgiveness, and that the faith community, they really force survivors to really forgive abusers for the better relationship, and also about the idea of family too. The married couple, they do not, or Christian, they do not encourage married couple to be separated. So these two are the main misconceptions that I had and in our community, which Sharon really addressed really well. So I don't think the extra explanation is needed. And also one thing about as I work with our faith leaders, another misconception about our faith communities is that they do not have practical resources for survivors. They only offer not so helpful support, such as prayers and So that's another misconception that I encountered as I work with faith leaders and faith community in our Korean immigrant community. And why is it so important to dispel these misconceptions is because it really harms our teamwork. It does take the whole community to really tackle these issues of gender-based violence. And in order to do that, we should be able to trust and work with our partners in that community. And these misconceptions about certain faith, it really hinders that. And in order to move forward, in our communities, the issues of gender-based violence is already tough to tackle. And in order to do that, in order to move forward, it is only possible when these misconceptions are addressed. So I think it is really important to really tackle that and address the misconceptions that we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sunny. Appreciate it. And Sunny's also put her information into the chat if anyone has any follow-up questions or wants to work specifically with the Korean Christian community. So next, we're going to be calling on the Sikh Family Center and Peaceful Families Project as our presenters today. Before we begin, I just want to pose a question to our presenters. We're going to be talking a lot about cultural competency throughout today's presentation. And so one of the lasting questions that we often hear is, what is the difference or comparison or connection between culture and faith? So as you both present, would definitely appreciate an answer to that question as well. Now we're going to start with Malika from the Sikh Family Center, who's going to talk about culture, faith, humility, and gender justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here. So my name is Malika Kaur, and it's pronounced Sikh Family Center with a K, aspirated K at the end. So the Sikh faith, most of the people you see in the United States with turbans and beards are of Sikh faith. But when I say turbans and beards, we're talking largely about men who are identifiable. And then you see women, some who wear turbans, some who wear scarves, some who don't cover their head, as I don't. So there's a lot of diversity in the community, but it's also often a community that goes unidentified or misidentified or invisibilized or thought of as part of another larger or other faith tradition. So happy to chat about that. If you're working with Sikh boys and men, there might be the general resistance or frustration or just fatigue they feel explaining who they are, despite being the fifth largest faith tradition in the world. I will start with that question of the connection between culture and faith. In my view, what we are talking about when we talk about engaging people of faith is actually a conversation about engaging people of different cultures. For some people, culture means different things to different people, but for people of faith traditions, faith is a large part of their context as human beings, is what defines what is standard and normal. It defines and helps people feel comfortable, connected. It gives shared beliefs and assumptions. So faith informs culture. And I think we're talking about, often when we're talking about engaging people of different faiths, we're talking about engaging in people of different cultures. So we can move to the next slide as I make these connections and explain why I think these are intimately connected and how we need to think about culture towards gender justice work. So what is culture? I know you can read, but I'm just going to pick a few things out of here from the definition. So historically thought to be stable pattern of beliefs, values, thoughts, norms, etc., passed on from one generation to the next, almost like a family heirloom. I mean, it's like passing on. Now, this is a old, antiquated, and outdated definition because it assumes a kind of rigidity and inflexibility. It ignores that culture is something that evolves, including in faith communities. So culture, if it's thought of as a noun, as older anthropology departments in the United States used to talk about it, if it's thought about as a noun, we are missing a large part of the picture. I would encourage folks to think of culture not just as an adjective, as a modifier of our behavior, but also as I think of it, we often talk about it as Sikh Family Center as a verb, something that's a state of being, something that informs action, something that is changeable, and that we're part of and we're molding as we go along. So can we move to the next slide, please? Or yeah. So culture is shared, unspoken. It is a set of norms. It's what we think of as normal, is often informed by the culture that we've known, that we've grown up in or associated ourselves with, what we feel familiar in. Culture is not spicy food or colorful scarves. Culture is not only something that's foreign and exotic and out there. We need to think of culture as, the example I've put in here is every courtroom has a culture. So if any of you have accompanied survivors to a courtroom, or if you're attorneys, I deliberately say every courtroom and not even courthouse, because I've experienced, representing survivors in one courtroom in the same courthouse. The judge sets a very different culture. And then in the next room, things might look entirely different. So again, set of norms, set of beliefs. Every police department, even in the same town, has its own culture. So and the examples are deliberate and very structural, even if, maybe more carceral here. But the reason I'm taking these examples is because I want to decouple thinking of cultures only attributed to certain people or people we don't understand enough, or people who look different or sound different from us, because that creates barriers to services, as so many have shared in the opening question. Okay, so when we think of the connection of culture and gender-based violence is cultural in that it's prevalent in almost all cultures. And I'm trying to be very exact by saying in almost all, just because there are small pockets of cultures that have been studied where gender-based violence isn't reported, but they're very small and minuscule. Cultures across, in cultures of different diversities, we notice gender-based violence. Yet, when you see the image in the center, this was artwork that was done for us during the pandemic. That's where the person's sitting alone and they're surrounded by plants, how we all turned inwards and did stuff that was good for us with a cup of tea. But when you see this person, you can imagine the word culture being used more because he's brown presenting, turban, beard, right? So if you do a little thought experiment of if this image was of a not brown person, not bearded person, not turban person, do we use the word culture? Do we think as service providers, as organizers? Do we, do we actually think about what is the culture here? So when we think about culture and when we don't think about culture is also something that, I wish to encourage us to play around with in our own minds. Culture is often used as a dog whistle, as something, so the word itself is used as, another dog whistle, or in other words, a message for an intended audience. And so, let me give you an example. If in an agency, we only use the word culture when we have people identifiably as part of a faith tradition coming to us, if that's the only time we use culture, or if we only use culture for immigrants, or if we only use culture for people who need an interpreter when we're providing services, we're sending a message in our agency, whether it's ill-intentioned or not. I think usually it's not ill-intentioned, but the impact, regardless of intention, is that these people are outside of the mainstream. There's something we can't understand, something that's different from us. So culture can often send a message of us and them and reinforce stereotypes, even when we don't mean to. So it's a word that can be loaded. So, in another example, the only time in front of a particular judge, we had many survivors go in front of a judge in restraining order cases, asking for adverse intervention services and programs for the restrained or party or the abusive party. And in one of the cases, even before I could open my mouth and say, Your Honor, she's asking for, and my client's asking for, the judge just turned towards the man who happened to be Muslim, and the judge knew that he was very active in his local community and in the mosque, and she just looked at him and said, well, in your culture, you need to understand there are certain things you can do that I will not permit in my blah, blah, blah. It completely out of line. And of course, I'm representing my client, and I had to stick with, well, my client's getting what she wants, but for the wrong reasons. The judge was, because of stereotypes, granting something that she otherwise wouldn't grant when my clients were white or were not of a cultural, faith community, etc. So we want to think about just how this word gets used and what sometimes the import is, because it can really, like I said before, further stereotype. So again, we want to, culture can mean different things to different people. I started with the fact that our faith system, our religious system, or spiritual belief might define our culture. For other people, language might be culture. For some other people, sexual identity, queer culture. For some people, ability. I work with clients in the deaf community. Deaf culture might be their cultural identity. And of course, for many people, these intersect, right? So let's take age. When you're working with boys of faith, every age group and generation has its culture. And just think, we work with young people, and the first time a young person said something about discord to me, now I know what it is, but I just looked at them like, right, there's a lot of discord in the world. And then I realized, oh yeah, no, that's the platform they all talk on. And, it's, so I had barely caught up with Instagram, and they were on to the next thing. So just every age group has its culture. And so if you overlay that with then their faith tradition and its culture, and perhaps language, culture, and other, so there obviously might be many intersections, but we do want to remain aware and always curious, which I'll get to in a minute, about what culture means to someone. And when we use the word culture, how we might be putting our own values, our own value judgments, I should say. We want to be attentive to diversities within cultures. So, for example, nationality may be one way to define culture, but for some people, us assuming that nationality is the way to define their culture might be really off-putting, even alienating. So take the example of Sikh boys and men. If we have definitely worked with many people in our community who will report talking to an agency and being, labeled as Indian. For some, that makes perfect sense. Their parents were from India, grandparents, or they were. For others, They're part of an asylee community that fled India and state-sponsored violence. So for them, being labeled as Indian is actually alienating or triggering or traumatizing in itself. And they have to kind of explain, no, I don't identify that way. So we want to ask people how they identify instead of giving huge labels like Chinese, Indian, Afghani. These are big labels. We want to think about what are the diversities within and how a person actually identifies in order to call them in a better, gentler way and in a sustainable way where they feel welcome and they feel that they can share what they how they identify and what they identify with. This could, be several hours of training. So I'm just gonna, it's a placeholder and reminder that knowing and owning our own privilege is really essential in this work of being able to work across cultures and in a way that's inclusive and promotes equity and justice. Because our privilege, our own unearned access to resources and and how we glide through the world, assuming others may have those resources, that, I'm just defining privilege in those terms, that can really inform what we think somebody else may or may not have. So if you did not grow up in a situation where your father entirely changed your demeanor every time he walked by somebody in police uniform, or if you've never grown up knowing that your faith center may be attacked in another incident of hate, you may have certain assumptions about what is safe and what is not safe. So our privilege really informs how we think other people experience and enjoy or don't enjoy the world. And so knowing and being continuously curious about what assumptions am I making can be really is really essential to this work. So culture, the challenge in gender-based work that has always existed is that we must neither ignore culture nor overstate it. So this is a delicate balancing act, because the reason we can't ignore culture is it informs many reasons for why people, I'm taking one example here, stay in an abusive situation. There might be a lot of these reasons apply across cultures, but there might be particularly heightened reasons within somebody's faith tradition or culture, a faith community and cultural community that inform their reasons to not, for not being able to leave a difficult or even abusive situations. So I'll take the example of the good wife trap. That's one of them mentioned on this slide. I worked outside of the Sikh Family Center context with survivors from different backgrounds, and I remember working with a woman who identified as a Jehovah's Witness, and her entire culture, all her connections, all of her community, all her friends were all within her faith group. And she was repeatedly up against a very internalized idea of what it meant to be a good wife, as well as working with others to kind of explore what are my exceptions and options. So she felt that was one of the biggest things she herself, and she would repeatedly say this, has to overcome before she takes any steps to move out of that relationship. And giving her the time and space to do that, and to do that with people she trusted, which were her own faith community, was really essential to build trust with her and would build trust with her allies, who often deal with a lot of biases about their community, a lot of preconceived notions, a lot of just a lot of stereotypes. And so once people in her community knew that she was working with advocates who were willing to take the lead from her and how she wanted to pace things, were willing to talk to others within her allies and friends within her community, the relationship grew, the trust grew, and it was easier to work with and support the survivor and bolster her sources of support in the community. So culture is the context of somebody's context, and that's important to know, keep in mind, to honor. And also and this is a visual developed by the Asian Pacific Islander Institute for Gender-Based Violence, but culture can also inform certain types of at times even normalized violence in communities or in societies where people think, yeah, right, like everybody knows XYZ, are the biases that we face as women or as gender minorities. So there might be certain ideas that are culturally just made either normal or, and by normal, I don't mean they're accepted by everyone. It's something that people know exists out there and feel there aren't enough resources to do anything about. So we want to understand when a survivor says it wasn't that bad, or when a survivor's son comes and tells us, like, this time it wasn't, this wasn't as bad as what my aunt faced or whatever else. We want to unpack what is their baseline, what is that cultural baseline they're coming in with, to better understand what it is that we're trying to support them with, or we might be able to support them with. So culture cannot be ignored, but at the same time, culture should not become an excuse to ignore other barriers. So I'll unpack that. So this is, from a great paper that's aged really well by Professor Letty Volpe at Berkeley Law. And what she says here about culture is that when cultural explanations are given, an insular, static culture is blamed, detracting attention away from limited access to services or from policies of the state. In other words, what she's saying is that what is coded as culture might actually be structural barriers. So for example, we might say, oh, in their culture, they don't like to talk about X. Well, they didn't have an interpreter. Or you found them an interpreter who doesn't speak their dialect. Or somebody on your staff, kept interrupting them because English is their third language. So there might be language barriers that are structural, that are being not corrected by the institutions, and then using the excuse, oh yeah, culturally, this is something that's very hush-hush. So again, culture should not be confused with other structural barriers. Or somebody, the son doesn't want to work with us in supporting the mother. Well, perhaps the whole family's undocumented and the son has status on DACA and is worried that they're all going to be deported except for him. And he has that fear in his mind that's causing him not to engage. So again, a bigger structural barrier that we might be coding improperly and accurately as culture. There might be mistrust of agencies, right? There might be biases within even our own nonprofit agencies that we need to think about. I've mentioned this before as well, but if we are creating a condition in which somebody is constantly feeling like they're being treated as a little bit the other or on the margin, and then we turn around and say, well, like in their culture, they don't, talk about sexualized violence, for example. Well, sexualized violence across cultures is very difficult to talk about. And on top of it, if we add the barrier of treating somebody as unknown, the other, exotic, obviously the silencing effect is multiplied. So what do we want to do? Right? What not to do has been mentioned, and some of what we want to do. We just like there is no one kind of victim or survivor, there is no one kind of man or boy within any cultural group. So if you say, all Jewish boys believe, all Muslim boys believe, all Sikh boys believe, right? We're making a huge, large assumption that will, of course, be inaccurate, but it can also be unhelpful. It can be off-putting, and beyond superficial connections. Here are some strategies for what we might want to do instead. So instead of saying something superficial like, oh, I've worked with many Zoroastrian survivors, right? Instead of that, could we ask, rather than assuming what somebody's beliefs are, what somebody's baseline is, what somebody's various concerns and risk factors are, ask questions. Avoid casting any belief as particularly regressive or conservative, right? Instead of saying things like, oh, that person has a really long beard, they must be very conservative. Engage on the actual beliefs, engage on what their beliefs are, and focus on and refocus on our shared end goal of ending violence, rather than on insisting to use certain terminology or phraseology. Bringing our curiosity, asking about role models in their own community, asking about historic points where there was cultural change work or work that was done to build more egalitarianism is essential. Asking about, as I think Sunhee mentioned this before, asking about services within faith centers instead of assuming they are barriers to our work, saying how can we strengthen work through community and through faith cultures. So more of a strengths-based approach rather than a shame-based approach, instead of saying like, oh, of course, in your community, nobody will understand you, or, you know, the community should be ashamed, it's looked away from XYZ. What can the community do? What is it doing? And how can we build on that and enhance that? And all of this, I think, is actual culture humility. It's not a skill that we just get check mark because we attended a presentation. It's more coming from a place of wanting to learn, and that humility is essential. I'm going to pass it on to Denise with an eye on time because I said some of this before.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about cultural competency, looking at faith-based communities in general, around issues of sort of domestic violence, programming with men and boys, from also an organizational point of view. So how do we manage that, not only as individuals, not only sort of our own beliefs and thoughts, but also as organizations? So what sort of, as my wonderful colleague was talking about, so what do we do about that? What do we, what are some of the resolutions? And let me see if I can change, there we go. So cultural competence describes this ongoing process that individuals and organizations and systems use to sort of respectfully respond to the needs of a wider range of individuals who need to access their services or programs or sort of structures. It involves creating systems of care that address different beliefs, lifestyles, and desired outcomes for diverse populations, right? So that we know that every level of our service has to be defined by who those folks are and what their desired outcomes are. It addresses multiple levels of organizational, structural aspects of our services, including staff, language, accessibility, thoughts, attitudes, mission, acceptance, knowledge, and action, at the level of program design, at the level of policies, and at the level of outcomes. It is a spectrum and a process. It is not something, again, as my colleague said, it's not something that we check off our list because we've taken a particular class or we've gone to a particular workshop. It goes on, it changes, it grows. There's no sort of litmus test for, yes, you are now culturally competent, or no, you are not. It is something that forms and grows, and that is a process over time. So what do you think about, and I'm going to get rid of some of my faith. So in the United States, actually, we have more sort of differences between secular versus faith communities that we do in between our faith communities ourselves. A lot of times within our faith communities, we very much understand each other, but are looked at differently from secular organizations. And these were images, by the way, that I pulled up just Googling what do people of faith look like, right? So many US-based providers, many of whom, again, are secular in nature, believe that faith is something that should be practiced sort of privately. It should be in that home. And that's part of, a little bit of our misconception of what freedom of religion is you are free to have that religion, but it should be sort of hidden away. And then in public, we should all look the same and act the same and believe the same. So a lot of our providers and even some of our language and policy is that faith is something that is practiced, that should be done at home, it's private, and it really shouldn't be addressed in outreach or intervention services, right? We should almost ignore it. And then, of course, we have a lot of sort of what people think about when they hear you're a person of faith, right? So when we look at, and you saw some of those images on the last slide, what do people think? What do general mainstream people think when they hear you are a person of faith? And this could be any faith, right? Certainly for us in the Muslim community, the first thing that comes to mind is that you're radicalized, that you are violent, that you are a little bit crazy, right? You don't believe in science, that you're not educated, right? So the fact that I have a PhD, sort of like that must be something out of the norm, right? That we're very traditional, that we follow old rules, that we're very conservative, that by definition our religious traditions, faith traditions, are oppressive to women and children. In fact, I did a training for police officers in Texas, of all things, who said to me, "Oh, don't worry, right? We don't even arrest when it's domestic violence in your community because we know that's just the way you believe." I was like, "Oh, thank you so much for that cultural competency," right? That there is a piece of our faiths that condone violence, and this is especially true when we're talking about Islamophobia and Muslim communities, that we're always serious, that we're against fun, that we're against anything, happy or frivolous. All of those things come to the conversation when people hear that you're a person of faith. Now, what I will say is that there are differences, that people of faith are distinct from the secular community in multiple levels, from both superficial, and we talked about the way that we dress, the way that we eat. One of our colleagues at JWI said we live alternative lifestyles, right? But also there are differences, and there are real differences about beliefs of morality, right and wrong, individual versus collective rights. There are multiple ways in that people of faith are very different from people who are secular, meaning that do not use faith as a base or a core when making life decisions. And that may look like, again, things as simple as we wear different kinds of clothes, we eat different kinds of foods, there are restrictions to the foods that we eat. We may have different family structure, who lives together, who doesn't live together, how long you're supposed to live with your family. We have different beliefs about gender roles, about definition of success, about the emphasis on formal education versus religious education or home education. Different life goals, relationships with money, customs of child rearing, different beliefs about individual versus collective rights, the right of an individual versus the right of the family or the community, differential definitions of what even normal is or looks like, and then different values and ideas of morality, of what is right and what is wrong. So that we don't all just sort of hold hands, sing kumbaya, and imagine that we are all the same. We really are not all the same, and that's okay. So we also know that within our faith groups, no matter between people of faith and then even within our own faith groups, we differ from each other, and we call that intersectionality. So there's intersectional differences when we look at race, when we look at faith tradition, because even within our faith traditions, there are different branches, level of religiosity within the community, gender, cultural differences, ethnicity, class, nationality, history, education, immigration status, all of those things make us look different, even though we may have the same faith. And I will go back to that first question, which is what is the sort of this idea of culture versus faith? And for our work at Peaceful Families, a lot of what we do is to educate our own communities about what is our faith tradition versus what they have been taught culturally. And there are a lot of disconnects between, depending on where people have grown up, how deeply they understood their religious tradition versus their cultural context or the geopolitical spaces that they were living in. That makes that very different. So sometimes, even within our own faith tradition, and Islam within the United States context is the most diverse faith group that exists within the United States, because we do differ so greatly between all of these things, including language. So when we talk about the domestic violence field and cultural competency, what would that really look like? So a culturally competent field, so if we look at the domestic violence field, not us as individuals, not our particular agencies, but as a field, what are some of the things that we need to be culturally competent? One of the first things that we need are diverse professionals that represent the full range of clients that we serve. And that really gets to questions of how do we recruit? How do we hire? What does our training look like? And how do we support professionals from faith-based communities, from differential language communities, from different racial communities? How do we make sure that when an individual walks into a domestic violence shelter, service provision program, that they are going to find folks that look like them, that talk like them, that believe the same things that they believe. We also have to have diverse perspectives, which means addressing a variety of beliefs, needs, issues, and obstacles to service that potential clients face. We don't imagine that everybody walking through the door is looking for the same thing. And I'll talk a little bit about sort of the bias. There's bias within the field when we look at individuals of faith, but there's also bias within individuals of faith and faith groups when we walk through doors of agencies that are presenting themselves as domestic violence agencies, because of the history that communities of faith and communities, marginalized communities and different communities and all of those kinds of folks have had when they walk into an organization that says they are working toward the end of domestic violence. Because there is belief that when I walk through that door, they're going to tell me to leave my family. They're going to tell me that only my desire to leave is important. They're going to tell me that my faith is holding me back. So we also have biases when we walk into agencies and we are waiting to hear certain messages. We also need diverse strategies. And we need strategies that address, reach, and lead to positive treatment results or positive program results for the entire participant population. So what specialized programs are needed in the community? What methodology works best? We are not all the same, and we cannot be offered cookie cuttered or just translated, right? So if I take my program manual and I translate into Arabic or to French, and just imagine that all I need to do is make you understand the language, and that's going to be okay. We really need diverse strategies that work on the specific issues within that community, but also the specific strengths and resources that exist within differential communities. We also have to admit, as a service sort of area, especially in the area of domestic violence, that we have history, that we're not starting from a base zero. So we do know that the work in domestic violence originated from the women's liberation movement in the 70s, that the US domestic violence field initially focused on educated, mainstream, white, Christian women with middle to high socioeconomic status, and who looked much more like each other than the sort of wide variety of clientele that we might have now. That we know that interventions, which started out with criminalization, domestic violence charges, orders of protection, shelters, and survivor independence did not always meet the diverse needs of marginalized groups, of diverse groups, including people of color, communities facing police violence, poverty, discrimination, immigrant victims, and religious minorities. So what folks were being offered was not always what they needed or what they were asking for. We know that imported interventions, which is to say, I write an intervention for a white middle class woman of Christian origin, do not always take into account the unique challenges of different communities, leaving some feeling excluded from the conversation. They also miss a lot of strengths and resources within both individuals and their communities. In response, many communities have established their own organizations and intervention tailored to their own specific experiences, but also may actively avoid agencies that have reputations of giving these kinds of services that were not inclusive and that were not really helpful to the communities that are seeking service. So by definition, when we go into unique communities, especially communities of faith, we may not be starting from zero. We may need to clean up some of our reputation or the reputation of the field that happened before us. When we talk about what a culturally competent organization looks like, culturally competent organizations must be based in diverse leadership, including planning, recruitment, and hiring of diverse staff at every level, which means more than we're going to hire an outreach worker who speaks Arabic, or we're going to hire a male who is Muslim to be able to work within this community. That is not enough. When we talk about culturally competent organizations, we're talking about organizations that from the top down look like the communities that they are serving. Culturally competent organizations recognize obstacles that separate their services from the needed communities, including prejudice, treatment practice, as well as more hidden biases, right? So we need to look inward. We need to reflect. It isn't about necessarily learning about communities of color or communities of different cultures or communities of different faiths. It's also about looking inward to ourselves and saying, who are we? What do we believe? And how might that be getting in the way of our providing good and equitable and inclusive services? Culturally competent organizations look to increase their knowledge and expertise in serving different groups. They proactively plan and search for ways to be more relevant to diverse groups. And then that's where we can sort of congratulate you all for being here and saying thank you for taking this time out of your day to really look at, what do I need to do? What does my agency need to do? Culturally competent organizations evaluate their programs and strategies to ensure that their participants are reaching sustainable goals that make an impact in their lives, and what that looks like within their cultural, religious, linguistic, national sort of context of the world. So we're not creating programs that have outcomes that are not meaningful to the communities that are participating in them. So all of this is a little bit of a headache. It takes a lot of time. It takes diversity in hiring. It takes a lot of self-reflection. So why bother? Why do we need culturally competent services? Why can't we just kind of do what we've always been doing? So one of the reasons is individual treatment success or individual program success. We know that services are going to be more effective if they are planned and completed with diversity in mind. One of the things that our organization has now is a faith-based what we call domestic violence intervention program. So what used to be called batterers programs. And what we know from the literature is, despite the fact that batterers intervention programs have been in place for over 50 years, they have been horrifically mediocre in outcomes. And part of that was because, and this is according to the research, not according to just my opinion, although it's my opinion as well, is because they became very secular. They became very open in that we talked generally about behavior, but didn't get to beliefs about gender-based violence. We didn't get to sort of the inner crust of why people were engaging in domestic violence behavior. Because we took all of culture, all of religion, all of faith and historical traditions out, those programs became sort of non-effective. So when we put back in what meaning, in terms of meaning of culture, meaning of religion, meaning of faith, meaning of linguistics, of nationality, all of those things, we get better outcomes. We also are talking about community well-being. So our services will need to make a difference in the lives of individuals and in the community as a whole. And we can serve all actors of the population with critical needs when we have programs that are diverse enough that they make sense to the wider portion of the community. We can also talk about economics, that our organizations may have financial gain if we can serve a more diverse population that have access to various funding sources, and that also may utilize our services for fee payment. There's also, of course, unity. Serving equally all citizens will increase a feeling of identity and augment our strength as a society. And then, of course, there's the well-being of our staff. We are more comfortable when we are addressing issues in a way that serves our clients, right? So that we don't feel like, oh, these people are not listening to me. Oh, why can't they just change? When we really talk to ourselves about, are able to talk with clients and learn from them, instead of sort of taking our message and trying to fit it in to a shape that it was not made to fit. So there are different models of stages of cultural competency, and you can hear some of these in people's discussions about how they feel about this field of cultural competency. So we have this the idea of cultural deconstruction, right? Which is the idea is that really we don't want diversity. We are a melting pot. We should people should all look the same, talk the same, buy the same things, follow the same rules. And that the mainstream is the best. There shouldn't be diversity. You know, you hear this, we all bleed the same blood, we all cry the same tears. Why do we need to be different at all when underneath we are on the same? We also have the idea of cultural incapacity. And those are folks who really just lack the skills to understand sort of how deep diversity goes. They just kind of assume that the majority culture is right without question at all. We have cultural denial, which is this idea of we're all alike, we should all be treated the same. There should be no acknowledgement that others may disagree. And I hear people say this all the time. I don't see color, I don't see faith, I don't see race, I treat everyone the same. And then we have this piece of pre-competence, so that we realize there's a difference, but we deal with it superficially. So I'll hire a case manager who speaks a language, and I'll treat people exactly the same, but I'll give it to them in their own language. And then we go to competence, which is the idea that we accept, appreciate, and accommodate difference. And that not only do we accommodate it, but we really begin to value diversity and examine our own culture and those around us. And this is the idea of, instead of a melting pot, a fruit salad. We're all different, we look different, we taste different, how we should be chopped up in the salad looks different, how we peel, everything is different, and that's okay. And then we have something called advanced competence, which really are folks who are advocating for diversity at every level, not only within their service, but looking at how systems and policies deal with diverse communities. And they're looking for ways to increase, sort of challenging themselves to new areas of diversity. So where do we start? Generally, there are 5 steps to creating cultural competency in an organization. One is having a well-defined service and knowing the community you serve best, right? So you don't want to sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? We don't want to go into an entirely different, we're going to start doing, healing circles and with fire and drums and all sorts of things. No, we want to stick to the well-defined service. We do work with men and boys. We do work with domestic violence survivors. We want to know what the service we do and who's the community that we are serving best at the moment. We also then want to take that next step of becoming aware of who are folks who need the service that we're doing, that are not able, for whatever reason, to be served by us in a good way. So who are the underserved populations in our area And what are their characteristics? What makes it difficult for them? And that goes into the next piece. Be aware of the client's barriers to our service. So we know that there are other victims out there, they don't speak the language, or they work during the day and can only come in the evening. Or many of them have children and they can't come in by themselves. Or they're not allowed to come into our services because we have men here and they're not allowed to be with men unaccompanied. So we want to find out what are the barriers to our service to those underserved populations. We want to build then connections to that community and include them and learn from them, right? So we want to have focus groups. We want to talk to religious leaders. We want to talk to community leaders. We want to talk with men and women. And especially in our work with men and boys, it's really important for us not to be seen as we're only talking to women victims. We believe that they're victimized. We believe that men and boys are the issue, the problem here. So we need to talk to the whole community. We need to talk with elders. We need to talk with younger people. We need to talk with folks who are more culturally adept at sort of accommodating the mainstream culture. We also want to deal with the folks who are sort of more isolated. We want to be able to involve the entire community. And it isn't just the idea of we're going in to educate you, to change you, but to really learn from you. So those initial conversations really have to be learning conversations. We also want to challenge our own institutions on diversity issues. So why can't we see people after 5? Why do we not have services on Sunday? Because that's the day that many of our clients have off. What are our feelings about talking with elders versus young people? All of those kinds of things, we want to challenge ourselves and ask ourselves those questions. And then we want to mediate and advocate for our group, not only at the service level, but we also to gain, to be a real advocate, to really go out and talk to larger structures. So intervene with police, with police systems, with court systems, with housing systems, and be able to open doors for the communities that we're dealing with some of those larger systems as well. So how do we do the work? So first, we want to define the vulnerable, diverse groups in our communities. We want to explore, understand, and value the differences between those groups. We want to recognize the various levels and the complexity of the diversity. We want to encourage conversation, sharing, learning, and teaching between groups. We want to let the group that we are trying to serve be our guides, teachers, and experts as to what they need at every level. We want to collaborate with individuals and associations that already exist within that group. We want to raise issues of advocacy within our own institution and community. And we want to create processes to include and expand our services for diverse groups. And what is the outcome? So again, these things take time, they take energy, they take grant funding, but what are the outcomes? So one is that we have better individual and programmatic outcomes, right? So because we're not trying to sort of force people into a program or into an outcome that doesn't make sense for them, we generally have better participation, we have better program completion, and we have better outcomes. We also have increased utilization of services, right? So we're not chasing people down and begging them to come in. We now have waiting lists because they know, because our agency has a good reputation within the community, that people come to us to seek service. We also have more professional level of programming. So our programs and our staff look different. They look better prepared for the world of diversity that is out there. We have improved reputation of our organization, and this is really important within communities of faith. Communities of faith will not go to organizations that they believe really do not serve people from their particular belief group. So the reputation of the organization is really important. Hopefully, when we say inshallah, we have more funding, right? Because we're now serving a variety of folks. We have higher numbers. we're actually maybe eligible for more funding. We have better staff retention because folks are feeling good about what they're doing. We have staff members from communities that are representative so that they feel like they're working for their community as well, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we know that when we become culturally competent, our services really do get better. So what gets in the way? Partially is denial, and we see that on both sides, right? So we've never had anybody, we've never had a English speaker come in to seek services. We've never had anyone from the Amish community come and look at our service, right? So it's really easy to say those folks just don't exist or they don't want our service. There is the fear of change, right? What will it look like if we have all these strange people in strange clothes coming in, and what will our regular clients feel, or how will they, address that? What will be seen as radicalized? Will be seen as radicalized as those faith groups do. Time limitations. It takes a long time to build rapport. It takes time to have interpretation in sessions. It takes time to understand and really listen to somebody's religious angst or faith-based angst about something that we're doing. The lack of trust, right? So how do we build relationships within that community so that people don't come in thinking this person is going to try to get me to leave my religion? This person is going to try to get me to make a decision that is not appropriate within my community. Knowledge, right? So not knowing where to begin, not knowing who are the folks in our community that might be underserved. Limitations in outreach, right? So how do we get into those communities? How do we talk to folks? Desire for a quick fix. Okay, so there's a grant out there for working with men and boys of faith. We need that money. Let's just take it and we'll figure it out, instead of really doing the research and building those relationships ongoing. Minimal motivation. Some folks really just want to sit in their offices and see who they've always seen because it's easy, and it's something that they know. And creativity or the lack thereof, right? I don't even know. I don't even know how to begin to approach those people. I don't even know how to begin to talk to those people. They're so different than I am. The second piece is then, of course, we have to measure what we're doing. So how do we know if we're being culturally competent as both individuals and organizations, right? Unless we enter into some pretty uncomfortable discussions, because we can't ask ourselves, like, well, I feel very competent and I feel like we do a great job. We really need to figure out, how do we test this concept of cultural competency when we look at the diversity of the people walking into our door? How do we evaluate and measure the perspective that groups have of us? And are we ready to hear what their opinion of our service is? How do we test cultural competence differences in the treatment outcomes, right? So when we use somebody from the same cultural or faith group, do we have different outcomes than when we use a case manager who is not, or we use a group leader who is not? So we also need to measure. We don't leave science. We need to measure what we are doing and whether it's making a difference or not. And if it's not, then what are we doing wrong, or what do we need to change? So as individuals, we also have to remember that respect is not the same as tolerance. We don't just kind of say no judgment, but positive judgment. I'm fascinated by the way that your group looks at this. I'm really impressed by the resources that you use. Respect is based on knowledge and familiarity, right? So we can't respect somebody that we don't know. We need to understand, we need to have knowledge, we need to really have curiosity. That was something my colleague talked about. We need to have curiosity about other groups, what they think, how they're dealing with things, what can we utilize or incorporate. We also want to look at reciprocity, and that looks at the balance of power and creating a place really that we are equally valued, understood, and heard. We cannot truly become a partner with somebody who we feel like we are there serving them because they need us or they are less than us. Charity is not the same as justice, right? So we want systems that are not based on I'm such a good person, I'm going to help for you because you need my help, because your culture is a mess and because your faith tradition believes in violence. But really, the idea of we are in this, we are a team, and there are things that I really appreciate about your faith tradition, about your culture, about all of those kinds of things. I'm not doing you a favor. You're doing me a favor by allowing me to learn and work with your community. Responsiveness is when we make actual changes in what we think and do regarding diversity, not only with the other group, but with ourselves. It relies on us becoming less sure and less comfortable, asking more questions. So why do we do it this way? Why can't we do it another way? The way that we become experts is to begin to question our own expertise, right? To really begin to say, let me learn more, let me understand better. Okay, and I know we are moving into the last portion, which is this last question. And I think, Alana, you are going to take back over.
Thank you so much, Malika and Denise. Really appreciate your presentations today. I'm going to pose this closing question to members of our consortium. However, if there are any questions for our presenters as well, please put them into the chat. To move towards cultural competence, how can advocates practice cultural humility when addressing misconceptions to engage men of faith? This is the conclusion question, sort of sums up what both Dr. Berthe and Malika were saying today. Anyone want to take a stab at it first?
I will. This
Sharon.
is Sharon with Catholics for Family Peace. A line that I use oftentimes is, since it's so true, is to say, I'm interested in knowing more. I'm completely ignorant about this situation. What information would be useful for me to know? I'm somehow acknowledge that I'm clueless. And I oftentimes, people are very kind. So for example, meeting an Orthodox rabbi, oftentimes needing to wear a long-sleeved clothing is the norm. So it's good to check. Orthodox rabbis have always been kind, but just to say, I don't know what the practice is, I don't know what the protocol is, and I have always received useful information.
Great, thank you so much, Sharon. Suni.
I was gonna mute my mic. So to move forward, cultural competence, how can advocates practice cultural humility? I think it is important for our advocates to be humble and flexible. So we need to be able to accept that not everyone is on the same page, and be okay with it. Culturally speaking, we are all different, right? And we all come from very different cultural backgrounds. And we should be flexible enough to be able to identify where each person is, and everything starts from there, and come up with a strategy based on that. And also, last thing that I want to say that we have advocates should be able to protect ourselves as well. A lot of times, our own faith and opinions will be challenged, right? Some stronger, some not too strong, but I mean, sometimes it hurts. So advocates, we should all be able to we shouldn't let that get in our way and not take them personally. So I think it is important for advocates to be able to really protect ourselves as well.
Thank you so much. Ayana, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I was about to say, can I jump in? I think those are some great, this whole presentation was really great, and just for advocates to like sit in a space where they recognize I might have learned something or I might have been taught something and it's wrong and it's okay. And like I'm learning and I'm growing and being like flexibility and that willingness to like acknowledge you were wrong and also acknowledge that you have a lot of learning and growing to do. And that can be a wonderful space. And to really embrace it as this wonderful growing space instead of I'm wrong, ego, I don't have all the answers. You're not always going to have all the answers, right? Especially if you're working from a culture that's different from your own, from a faith that's different from your own. You shouldn't necessarily just have these automatic responses like that. It's not practical. And so to be really, to Sunny's point, be really authentic with how we're responding and holding ourselves accountable in how we're responding to people and communities as well, I think is just really important. And it's not a bad thing. It's not actually a scary thing when you start to do it, when you start to break down some of these narratives or some of these stories that we've learned, and recognizing like it's wrong. And like there's like this whole new world that's opened up to me, these whole new experiences that I can really delve into more. So.
Right. Definitely. Thank you, Ayana. It's about having that learning mindset. Yeah. Sandy, do you want to give it a shot?
Yes, sure thing. I think I like to keep two principles in mind for advocates. The first one that we talk about often is that you can't be curious and angry at the same time. When you have curiosity, your anger diminishes. So if you notice yourself being activated or being just taken aback by something that happens, I would say, take a breath and be curious. Like, why is this person thinking this way? What is happening in this moment? And asking questions. So asking questions is by far one of the first approaches that we teach. So be curious, ask questions rather than have assumptions. Many of us have many assumptions, and we operate from the assumptions. So instead of operating from assumptions, let's operate from curiosity. And we'll find that our assumptions are often just that, they're assumptions. And I think there's a principle that we'd like to call courageous presence, which is related, right? And so it's like as we notice ourselves being activated, as we learn that we're wrong or that we don't know something, being courageously present is keeping the goal in mind that what we want to do is to be advocates. What we want to work is we want to work towards a common goal. And so when I find myself being activated, it means taking a step back and checking in with my body. I think we often forget that we are advocates that are embodied individuals. And so checking in with our bodies will help us to take a breath, look around, have a moment, and then re-engage with the courage to fight for what is just and what is right. So re-engage by saying, okay, I can take care of myself. I can have what I need. And in this moment, the focus is the goal of bringing about a peaceful culture, etc.
That sounds great, Sandy. And I think also, as advocates who are often exposed to vicarious trauma, that grounding as well in approaching with curiosity definitely is helpful in that sense too. So thank you for bringing that up. Malika or Dr. Berthe, do you have anything that you want to add? I know we have a few minutes left before we head to our closing slide.
I think when I talk about this, it's also sort of having a sense of humor. We sort of have this beautiful. I had an elder, a native elder, tell me one time, and I was a little insulted. He's like, "I don't care if you believe me, you're not my child." Right. So I was like, wow, okay. But it really put things in perspective for me, which is to say, when I go out to other communities and I'm trying to explain, what's going on and faith-based things, is to really have a sense of humor. It's like, you know what? I don't need to convince you you're not my child, right? I don't need to make you understand. I just need to put the information out there, poke fun at some of the things that we believe about each other, some of those misperceptions that we have, and plant seeds. Know that we are not going to, deconstruct the patriarchy tomorrow, right? That isn't my job right now. Our job is to just plant seeds, is to be able to say, and so many people will then, if you're not in a combative, space where it's sort of like, okay, let me just tell you what we believe and what we think, and really plant those seeds. for that to grow and let that be that person's journey and that person's, that person's and the creation's sort of interaction with each other, that we don't have to prove everything. We don't have to be right. All we have to do is plant seeds.
Thank you.
I would just add that it's possible to be humble and continue to be fearless as advocates. So, coming back to the points Sunny and Ayana, Sandy were making about our own safety, our own authenticity in the work. It's okay to bring in humility, and it's also important to remain true to our core values of promoting equity and not excusing violence. We can understand it better. Explanations are different than excuses, so we can understand it better, but humility doesn't mean we're asking anyone to turn away from those core principles of being an advocate against violence. And in the Sikh tradition, we say, fear none, frighten none. And I think that's something that we can do with humility, curiosity, and grace for ourselves and others.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Malika. And thank you, everyone who's part of our Interfaith Consortium for answering these questions. And a special thank you to Dr. Berge and Malika for your presentation today. I just want to remind everyone on this call that everyone that you heard from, they are all part of our Interfaith Consortium. And we have monthly office hours. So we definitely recommend anytime you have any questions pertaining to any faith group that you're trying to engage with, or any male allies that you're trying to engage with of faith, definitely feel free to send us an email that can then be posed to the rest of the consortium, or come to our office hours, which are the second Thursday of every month. Does anyone have any other questions? Check the chat here. Okay. Great. So our next workshop is on the 29th of February, Navigating Intersection Identities, LGBTQ plus teens and teen dating violence prevention. And as I mentioned, our monthly office hours are every second Thursday of the month at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. You can register for any of this on our website as well, which I believe Derek put it into the chat. Thank you again for joining us, and feel free to reach out at any point with additional questions related to these topics. Thank you so much.